Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a special screencast-o-matic recording, which basically summarizes and explains the reading for the 12 other constitutional amendments that won't happen anytime soon, but probably should. This is from CNN's The Point. Many of you might be aware that we've watched this source before in class relating to current events and contemporary issues. This particular reading for today, however, will help us give us context for understanding the future of the Constitution. There's so many great ideas out there that really probably should be part of this wonderful document. However, because of political tides, tensions, and other exterior factors, most likely these provisions, as good as they might sound, may not actually be part of the Constitution anytime soon. However, let's set the stage. From CNN. Ending the concept of birthright citizenship isn't something Donald Trump just dreamed of yesterday. He's actually been talking about it for years, including just after his 2015 campaign announcement. Back then, he complained that a constitutional amendment to end the practice of granting citizenship to anyone born in the United States would take too long. What he was saying to CNN's Chris Cuomo more than 3 years ago as a new candidate isn't anything completely different than what he's said in recent days. Here's an exchange from August 19, 2015. Trump: Number one, the 14th Amendment is very questionable as whether or not somebody can come over and have a baby and immediately that baby is a citizen. Cuomo: I know. The court has pretty much said and agreed that immigrants here. This isn't a minority legal opinion you're talking about. Trump: Chris, there are many people that totally feel that, and Cuomo says they may have won it that way. But Trump said amending is too big of a deal. It's going to be taken. It will be 2 terms. I'd be in my 2nd term or my 8th year by the time, assuming everything went smoothly, because to amend the Constitution, I believe you can win it legally, okay? I believe you can win it legally. And in any event, the parents have to leave. If the parents leave, unless they are very bad people, they got to take their baby too. So now Trump is pushing the idea again as a way to fire up his base supporters in the waning days of an election where his party is expected to suffer losses that could cost them control of the House of Representatives. Whether he will actually follow through and sign some sort of executive action telling the government to essentially ignore the 14th Amendment after the heat of the election season is but over remains to be seen. But Trump is certainly right that amending the Constitution takes time. It's so hard, in fact, that it's only been done 17 times since the initial Bill of Rights was enacted. That's a total of 27 amendments in more than 200 years, the last of which was officially codified in 1992 after a decades-long effort. And that was for the politically benign purpose of not letting federal lawmakers raise their own salaries until after the next election. Something politically charged, like upending the amendment passed to guarantee citizenship to freed slaves, would be something else entirely. It's not unprecedented to pass an amendment undoing a previous amendment. If you guys recall, the 21st Amendment undid the 18th Amendment and ended prohibition, for instance. And just because it's hard to amend the Constitution doesn't mean there aren't a lot of ideas floating around about how it could be done. Search constitutional amendment in Congress's database of actively introduced legislation for the current Congress, and 142 official proposals pop up. Here are some of the highlights. Balance the budget. Despite the fact that the tax bill Republicans recently passed will explode the federal budget deficit in coming years, there are a large number of Republicans and a few Democrats who push a balanced budget amendment every few years. When the proposal has come to a vote, it's failed, as it did in April of this year, and as it has in years past. That won't stop it from becoming introduced again next year, and it won't stop the national debt from growing after decades of budget deficits. This number here depicts just the absurd amount of deficit spending in the United States of America. End the Electoral College. If Democrats have their own dream of constitutional reform, it would probably start with ending the Electoral College, that relic of the 18th century, which today gives more rural states a leg up in the presidential elections. That's how 2 of the last 3 presidents, both Republicans, were elected despite receiving fewer actual votes than any Democrat. With Republicans in control of the House, the Senate, and the White House in a majority of state legislatures, that one is going nowhere fast. End the income tax. Republicans enacted tax reform, and Trump wants to cut taxes even more. But Representative Steve King this year also introduced an amendment to undo the 16th Amendment and get rid of the income tax altogether. That would seem to run counter to the parallel idea of requiring a balanced budget each year, but neither one is gaining much traction. Control campaign spending. No Supreme Court decision of the last 2 decades rankles Democrats and some Republicans more than Citizens United, which gutted the U.S. campaign finance law under the guise of free speech. There are multiple proposals to amend the Constitution to fix it. This midterm election, by the way, will have $5 billion pumped into it. Enshrine rights to vote and to health care. You don't actually have a right to vote in the United States at the moment, Several amendments refer obliquely to a right to vote, but that's not it actually spelled out, like the right to speech or to bear arms is. That makes it easy for lawmakers to abridge voters' rights wherever they have political support. Think of this as a counterattack to efforts to put obstacles in front of voters, like requiring ID. There's a movement afoot, particularly after the Supreme Court gutted parts of the Civil Rights era Voting Rights Act to enshrine a right to vote as an amendment. Clarify Trump's pardoning power. Trump has used the power to pardon unlike any other president, handing out clemency as a political favor and to make political points. He hasn't ruled out pardoning his former aides for possible crimes related to the 2016 campaign. Representative Al Green has proposed an amendment that would clarify Trump cannot pardon himself. Equal rights for women and men. A proposed equal rights amendment has been in the works since 1923, and it is reintroduced each year in Congress. It has come closer than most of these proposals in reality. It passed both chambers of Congress in the 1970s, but it didn't get the required approval in 38 states to be added to the Constitution. Illinois' vote this year in favor of the amendment brings it to 37 the number of states that have signed on, just one shy of the 38 figure. Congress initially set a deadline to pass the amendment, and then it ran out in 1982. So when supporters find that 38th state, you can bet that there will be a fight over whether every state legislature vote is still valid. Here's the states that have not ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. It takes votes by 38 state legislatures to ratify an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Backers on Equal Rights Amendment, which states that civil rights may not be denied on the basis of one's sex, are one state short. Here are the 13 states where efforts to ratify the ERA have so far failed. Parental rights. This one, introduced by Republicans, would seek to give parents a constitutional right in the education of their child to choose alternatives to public education. Term limits. The president has two-term limit as laid out in the 22nd Amendment, but there are quite a few lawmakers who run each year and, of course, on putting term limits in place for themselves, particularly after a 1995 Supreme Court decision that nullified 23 state laws for term limits on their federal lawmakers. This amendment would make congressional term limits for every state. This proposed amendment probably has had the most bipartisan support. Both Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz support it. Make Washington, D.C. a state. There are a lot of U.S. citizens out there who don't have the same representation as everyone else. D.C. and Puerto Rico in particular have populations commensurate with some states, but with no voting members of Congress or senators. D.C. voters do have their votes counted in presidential elections in the form of the Electoral College votes, but Puerto Rico voters only get their presidential preference counted if they move to a state or D.C. D.C.'s delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, introduces the D.C. statehood proposal whenever possible. It's not technically an amendment, but it would require the repealing of the 23rd Amendment, which gave D.C. electoral votes. Ban flag burning. The Supreme Court has upheld flag burning as free speech protected by the First Amendment, but Congress has routinely considered such a flag burning amendment, which has passed the House at least 4 times in the 2000s, but failed in the Senate. It's notable that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, a Republican and staunch protector of the First Amendment, is opposed, so it would probably take a different Republican leader to get a movement on like this. And reapportion Congress by citizens rather than population. This is another King proposal, which would presumably mean fewer lawmakers in places with fewer non-citizens living there. The sad original text in the Constitution counted slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of apportionment. That language was undone by the 14th Amendment, which granted birthright citizenship. So as you guys can see, here are some great ideas, including the one we talked about in class about lowering the voting age to 16, that although might sound good, might be hard to actually fully implement in execution. But the fact is, as citizens of this nation, it doesn't hurt to think about the future, as very much so you might see some changes in the Constitution, or at least different readings of the Constitution throughout your lifetime. So once again, please fill in your chart by providing descriptions of each proposal and your own personal analysis whether or not this would be a good or a bad idea, and then you should be good to move on to the other parts of the lesson. Thank you very much for tuning in.